The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to Ruth Milkman, Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the City University of New York, or CUNY Graduate Center, and the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. She's also the co-editor with Deepak, Bhargava, and Penny Lewis of Immigration Matters, Movements, Visions, and Strategies for a Progressive Future. Ruth Milkman, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Your new book promises to offer fresh thinking for how to plan for a humane immigration system. Why is this a book that needed to be written now?
Well, so the book was published this year, but of course that means we prepared it in the prior year, during the Trump administration, actually, before we even knew whether Trump would be reelected or not last November. But our view was and remains that since Trump had made immigration so central to his political agenda, it was imperative to think through what it would mean for a new Democratic administration to take on these issues. And so that was the motivation. The book actually has already appeared in two different editions. The hardback came out in the spring, and then we added a new preface to the paperback, which just appeared last month, in which we lay out a little bit of information about what Biden did initially and so on. Although, of course, it's not up to date given the lead time for publication.
Now, the book identifies some of the thinking that needs to go by the wayside, and that includes the idea that immigrants take jobs from native-born workers. We've been hearing this one for years. Is there any indication that this is actually true?
Basically, the answer is no. You can find exceptional examples here and there where it might appear to be the case. But mostly immigrants and U.S.-born workers are concentrated in different kinds of jobs. And so there's actually not that much overlap. What we show in the book is that, in general, immigrants are hired in jobs that native-born workers are not interested in working in. It's a little more complicated than that, obviously, but getting back to your bigger question of the thinking that needs to go by the wayside, we call the thinking that it's still around, but that flourished in the Trump years, although it was not invented by Trump, goes back way before that, the immigrant threat narrative, the idea that immigrants are somehow a threat to the U.S. born. And that includes the issue of jobs, but also criminal activity. The allegation is, again, without any factual foundation, that immigrants commit more crimes than U.S.-born workers. Actually, the opposite is true if you look at the data. The idea that immigrants are a tax burden, and then, above all, this idea of taking quote-unquote American jobs. And so that's the kind of mythology that has flourished really for quite a few years, I would say since the 1990s, and then Trump really elevated it to this sort of central trope of his own political rhetoric. And we show that while this is a very attractive narrative for many people because of all the ways in which the society has changed, mostly for the worst in recent decades, and especially for non-college educated US-born workers who have suffered a great reversal of fortune in recent decades, this is like a very simple and appealing explanation for that. But actually, if you look at the facts, it turns out to be basically mythological. And we argue that while that reversal of fortune is important and one that everyone, including progressives, needs to pay attention to, the kind of challenge is to educate people to understand that what has caused that reversal of fortune is not immigration, but rather a combination of employer actions and public policies promoting various kinds of growth and inequality. So that's basically the argument, that the scapegoating of immigrants is misdirected. Let me give you just one example that illustrates the sort of extreme example of this, which is that we know from survey data that in areas that have been submitted to deindustrialization, that is factory closings where jobs have disappeared and, often to locations outside the United States. One author in our collection actually this term appears in something else he wrote, not in our book, calls them post-traumatic industrial cities, which I think is a beautiful term. That's Justin Guest's term for this kind of area. So in those places where there's very little economic opportunity of any kind, there really aren't very many immigrants typically. I'm talking about like abandoned steel towns, things like that. And yet the local population blames immigrants for the fact that their factory is no longer open, which if you just think about it for 5 seconds, it's complete nonsense. I mean, how could you possibly blame immigrants for that? This is clearly an action on the part of the corporate owner of the plant. And so that's like the extreme example of how misleading that the immigrant threat narrative can be. But you see it, in more complicated settings as well.
Well, I mean, I guess I understand just from what you've just said why it's so widely accepted. But where did this idea even come from? What started this? Why was it started this way? How did it get this way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't looked into that personally, but there is another book that recently appeared called The Walls Within by Sarah Coleman that argues that this actually dates back all the way to the 1970s, that it sort of originates there. So, and the reason the 70s are significant is because in 1965 is when immigration kind of resumed after a 4-decade pause. We all know that this country's population is made up overwhelmingly of immigrants and the descendants of immigrants. That's been true, with the exception of Native Americans and people who were brought here as slaves. Basically, the entire population derives from immigration. But in 1924, the doors closed. And that's a whole story in itself. But basically, the law changed and very few immigrants were admitted between 1924 and 1965. That changes in 1965. With the passage of something called the Hart-Celler Act, which abandoned the 1920 system of national quotas that was designed to restrict immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, basically, which were then the main sending areas to the United States. And it was done sort of in the civil rights era, and it was seen as an anti-discrimination measure. And the people who enacted it, including then President Johnson, who announced when he signed the bill, this isn't going to change anything. Don't worry. It's basically, they saw it as a symbolic gesture. But that's not what happened. Instead, as we all know now, immigration increased quite dramatically. By the 70s, there was a significant influx of folks. And unlike in the pre-1924 period, most of them hailed from Latin America, Asia, and to some extent, Africa. So very different from Southern and Eastern Europe. And while Southern and Eastern Europeans in the early 20th century were often seen as racially different from previous white Americans, now they're considered white. By 1965, that's the case. So you start to get this sort of racial inflection in the whole conversation about immigration. Oh, and another change is that before 1965, the Western Hemisphere was not covered by the previous immigration laws. So the influx of Mexicans, for example, changes in character also in 1965. So I think it has a kind of an origin in that period. And, there start to be, as Coleman shows, political disputes pretty early on about, what does all this mean for, fiscal policy? What does it mean for employment? And Well, so I think that doesn't really explain why it got so much traction in recent years. But again, it's not something Trump invented. He just kind of capitalized on it at a moment when, the economy was in very bad shape and people were looking for a simple explanation for it.
Yeah, he certainly put an added flame to that fire, if you will. We're speaking to Ruth Milkman, Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center and the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. She's also the co-editor with Deepak, Bhargava, and Penny Lewis of Immigration Matters, Movements, Visions, and Strategies for a Progressive Future. One of the things you offer is a new paradigm for rethinking the role of immigrants in the U.S. labor market. Can you sketch that out for us?
Sure. I want to do it in two pieces, though. So one of them is rooted in my own chapter in the book, and the other is a message that the book as a whole offers. So let me start with the second, which is that we suggest and offer evidence for the argument that immigration is basically good for the U.S. economy in a variety of ways, and that we need to fix the broken existing system and also have an orderly system of welcoming newcomers to these shores, not doing it in the way it's been done recently where people overstay visas or cross the border without authorization. This is not an argument for so-called open borders, but for an increased legal immigration to this country. And that would solve a lot of economic problems that we're now facing. For example, demography. We have an aging workforce. We're in a situation, as the recent census data that came out earlier this year show, where more and more elderly retired people are being supported through Social Security and such by a declining share of the population that's actually actively in the labor force. That's not sustainable. You see it especially acutely in certain occupations, like the tremendous shortage, and this is before the pandemic, of home care workers, for example, caring for disabled and elderly people in their own homes, which are in huge demand. And there's partly because the job pays very poorly, very few people interested in doing it. Most of them who do it are immigrants. So, well, that actually varies regionally, but in many parts of the country, including where I am here in New York, that's the case. So that's one piece, is that immigration is actually an economic plus. The other piece is a little more historical, and this is my own chapter in the book, and I've written about this elsewhere too, where I try to argue two things. Well, basically that if you look at the historical sequence of events by which immigrants become incorporated into particular sectors of the labor market, you can see, who's responsible for that change. So, for example, in male-dominated, once unionized industries like residential construction, which is now largely non-union, although in the 1960s was heavily unionized in what are now the blue states. What happened was this: employers decided that they were interested in reducing their labor costs, and that meant attacking organized labor in that sector. They went about doing that quite systematically and fairly successfully in many markets. And what happened was these were workers who were mostly white men who had been earning, pretty good hourly wages, especially for non-college educated folks who, didn't have the option of becoming professional employees or managers in most cases. They had excellent benefits, pensions, the works, the kind of jobs we all mourn the loss of. And so as the industry became non-union, and it's a complicated thing in construction because there's so many layers of subcontracting, basically it means the developers hire non-union subcontractors, which they increasingly did, who underbid by not being unionized, the unionized contractor. So that happens over a period of time, starting in the 70s. And pretty soon, the people who've been doing the work look at what the jobs have become, and I'm not doing this. This is not acceptable. I'm used to this other standard. And in that case, we kind of know where a lot of them went. They moved into commercial construction, which, building office buildings and stuff like that, which remained highly unionized. So, and there was actually in some of these periods, like in the early 1980s, there's a huge building boom in commercial construction. So it was kind of easy for people to make that transition. And then the employers fill the residential construction workforce, the vacancies that are created by this exodus of U.S. foreign workers, with immigrants. So the idea that immigrants somehow cause job loss it's sort of exactly backwards. Like it's because U.S. workers abandoned jobs that had been degraded that immigrants were hired. and often recruited actively from south of the border in this case. It's not that they were waiting around looking for work. The employers went after them. So again, the target of the rage that non-college educated workers justly feel about their economic plight should not be directed at immigrants, but rather at those employers who deunionized what were once highly desirable jobs. There's another kind of example, which is different, which mostly involves women workers. And that's paid domestic labor, maids, nannies, and workers like that. Home care is a little different, but sort of fits the story too. So those jobs were historically dominated by African-American women. And then in the 1960s, when Title VII of the Civil Rights Act becomes law, prohibiting race discrimination in employment, and also as a result of the civil rights movement itself, new opportunities open up for Black women that had not really been available to them prior to that. So instead of being restricted to jobs like domestic work, they're able to get clerical jobs, service jobs, basically the jobs that white women have had all along are now become more racially integrated. And there's a dramatic exodus from domestic work into those kinds of jobs by especially younger Black women. So it's kind of the same story I just told about construction, with one important difference, which is that these were never good jobs. They were not unionized. They didn't pay very well. They were, and for Black women in particular, they had the stigma of the kind of historical legacy of slavery. There were all kinds of ways in which they were undesirable. But what's the same is that Black women decided once there were other options, they were going to not do this work anymore. And then employers, in this case, private households, turned to immigrants. So it's the same kind of story where immigration is the result, not the cause of transformation in the labor market.
And this is something that continues to be perpetuated. This thinking that the jobs are taken away. That, I mean, just a basic increase in the federal minimum wage could alter this some. And because of the pandemic too, we're also seeing folks that are saying, you know what, I don't know that I want to go back into that industry. Does that in turn then perpetuate even further this myth that immigrants are taking away our jobs at yet another level?
Well, in some ways, sure. There's another twist, though, in the recent period, which is that starting in 2008, there's actually very little new immigration to the United States, particularly of low-wage workers, partly because immigration is basically demand-driven. It's when employers are looking for labor that people come because they know they can get work. That's the main motivation for most immigrants. That's different from refugees, like those that arrived here recently from Afghanistan. Obviously, that's a totally different dynamic. But anyway, when the economy crashed in 2008 and unemployment surged, immigration kind of stops dead, especially from south of the US-Mexico border. It's beginning to resume now, but very recently, like this is not so, so it's complicated. It's not quite that simple, but you could argue that some of the labor shortages that we're seeing now are partly due to that cessation of immigration. I mean, we don't really want to perpetuate the situation that led to that in the first place. That is the degradation of jobs that let employers seeking cheap labor to encourage immigration. Like, that's not really that desirable either. So I agree with you that like increasing the minimum wage and stuff like that is a much better approach. And we're sort of seeing some of that right now. I mean, the pandemic, there was zero immigration during that. Well, I'm using the past tense, which I'm not sure is appropriate quite yet, but that's like a very specific situation, which hopefully is a short-term one. But, you could see this going back a whole decade, at least, prior to the pandemic too. Yeah, absolutely. Now, you and your contributors share a belief that merely undoing Trump's immigration restrictions, not enough. Why is it so important for progressives to present a positive immigration agenda, and what should that look like? Well, that's a big question that I can't answer in one sentence. No. Trump's agenda, orchestrated mostly by this guy, Stephen Miller, who was one of his close aides and who, was laser focused on immigration during the entire time that Trump was in office. Their goal was to restrict immigration, not only undocumented or illegal, as they called it, immigration, but legal immigration. They took a lot of steps to try to do that. They wanted to limit the number of refugees and on and on. So Biden did reverse some of that immediately. Like a lot of it was done by executive orders under Trump rather than because in earlier times and probably now, it's very difficult to get anything through Congress. So it's pretty easy to undo executive orders when you're a new executive. And Biden did do that. So he, got rid of the so-called Muslim ban and, many of the other things. He increased the acceptance of refugees. But no, that isn't enough because we have a broken system. I think that's the one thing that everybody agrees on, that the system is completely dysfunctional the way it is now. And there's a bunch of things that need to be addressed. The most obvious is the 11 million unauthorized immigrants who live in the United States right now and don't have, are living in the shadows and fearful of apprehension and, can't really contribute their full energies to American society, even though most of them have lived here for quite a long time already. So that's been partially addressed in the Obama years by deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, the so-called Dreamers. Some people who are eligible for that have a kind of precarious but legal status that allows them to go to school and get financial aid in many places and work and all that. And there's a few other groups like that that have some kind of temporary status. But the bulk of that 11 million people doesn't have it, and that needs to be fixed. And I think there's a general consensus, maybe not in Congress, but in the US population, that those people should be given some kind of path to legal status. It's not really that controversial anymore, but nevertheless, it hasn't happened. So that's one piece. But that's only part of it. And by the way, that's a minority of all the foreign-born people who live in this country. A much bigger chunk are naturalized citizens, for example, and others who have green cards. But the bigger and more complicated question is, what should the United States' policy be in regard to potential new arrivals, what's sometimes called future flow? So we try to address that too. And again, on the premise that we think immigration contributes in a positive way to both the society and the economy, that there should be a more generous policy in terms of welcoming new people to these shores, on a variety of grounds. And then there's another piece too, which is refugees. So that's complicated business, as we're hearing more and more, especially when we're talking right now during the climate change summit in Glasgow. There are going to be more, and there already are quite a few climate refugees who are fleeing devastated communities and countries, and some of them are trying to come to the United States. And insofar as the US has a lot of the responsibility for those climate catastrophes, we should have a policy that recognizes that and welcomes those individuals to the country. And then, I think the Afghanistan case offers another example of a case where a very extreme example of where US foreign policy has created a flow of refugees. It's also true in other parts of the world, Central America, for example, where a lot of the chaos and violence in the, countries like Honduras is due to US foreign policy. So our immigration policy should reflect the reality that the US has some responsibility here, and we should be welcoming refugees from those places. So it's a combination of that, and then, a more welcoming attitude to immigrants more generally. We point out in the book that the foreign-born share of the US population is actually not that high relative to other rich countries. It's much higher in Switzerland, for example. It's about double. So, we've got, contrary to what Trump used to say, there's no more room. That's really not true. And we know, everything from the history of immigrants winning all these Nobel Prizes and, innovating and starting important innovative companies to the need for home care workers, all across the spectrum of the labor force, we see that immigrants make important contributions. So rather than being fearful of that, we should be welcoming it, is what we argue.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to embrace there, and here we are fighting it, turning it away, and that kind of thing. It doesn't make any sense. As we all well know, any strategy to craft a more humane immigration system is a battle for hearts and minds. Do you believe, Ruth, that the nation and our politicians are ready to hear new ideas?
Well, let's start with the easier part, which is the 11 million undocumented folks who live here already. I think the hearts and minds are already won by the vast bulk of the U.S. population, and people see that they actually, in many cases, have interactions with some of those folks, and they know that this is crazy to not have a path to legalization for them. So the hearts and minds are already there. The politicians haven't gotten their act together, partly because I think they feel that they need to address that in concert with the other pieces of changed immigration policy. And, that's been debated too, all by itself. Should those issues be treated separately or together? But the latter seems to be the main approach. And so that's been an issue. I think this has become entangled in the polarized political debates in Washington in an unfortunate way. And that, rationality sort of gets lost in the partisan bickering about all this. So I'm not sure the politicians are ready. I think the population would like to see this problem addressed. And maybe it will be once we get through the current mess over the Build Back Better Act, which, by the way, does have the possibility, I think it's unlikely, but there is a proposal in the House version for a partial solution to some of this. It probably will get lost in the shuffle, but maybe not. That would be a good step forward.
We can hope. We can hope. We can hope. Ruth Milkman, Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center and the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Of course, Ruth, also the co-editor with Deepak, Bhargava, and Penny Lewis of Immigration Matters, Movements, Visions, and Strategies for a Progressive Future. Ruth, we appreciate your time with us today. Would love to have you back again soon.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Ho, ho, ho! Wait till you hear about the gifts I gave to some of America's power elites for Christmas. To each of our Congress critters, I sent my fondest wish that from now on they receive the exact same income, health care, and pensions that we average citizens get. If they receive only the American average, it might make them a little bit more humble and less cavalier about ignoring the needs of regular folks. To the stockings of GOP leaders who've so eagerly debased themselves to serve the madness of Donald Trump, I added individual spritzer bottles of fragrances like Essence of Integrity and Eau de Self-Respect to help cover up their stench. And in the stockings of Democratic congressional leaders, I put Spice of Viagra and Bouquet du Grassroots to stiffen their spines and remind them of who they represent. For America's CEOs, my gift is a beautifully boxed brand new set of corporate ethics. It's called the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Going to pollute someone's neighborhood? Then you have to live there too. Going to slash wages and benefits? Then slash yours as well. Going to move your manufacturing to sweatshops in China? Then put your office right inside the worst sweatshop. Executive life won't be as luxurious, but CEOs would glow with a new purity of spirit. To the Wall Street hedge fund hucksters who've conglomerated, plundered, and degraded hundreds of America's newspapers, I've sent copies of Journalism for Dummies and offered jobs for each of them in their stripped-down Dickensian newsrooms. Good luck to each. This is Jim Hightower saying, and what better gift to the Trump family, Donald, Ivanka, and Jared, Eric, Donnie Jr., and the whole nest of them, than to wish that they live with each other constantly and permanently. No, really, no need to thank me. Each of you deserve it.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This social security measure.
I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee.
I want to ask you, when did you realize you were there covering the campaign, but then you were in the White House and in the front row, president of our White House Correspondents Association? When did you realize that this presidency was not just like any other presidency, that this one was fundamentally different?
I mean, I think that probably happened before he was elected.
Yeah.
I mean, it was clear that's where we were heading. But there was one moment early on that I just realized that we were in entirely different territory here. And that was when, Trump in a random tweet, if I recall, it was on a Saturday, accused Barack Obama of wiretapping Trump Tower. And not only was that just bonkers, and not only did he spell wiretap with two P's, but none of his people had any idea what he was talking about. I mean, I reached out to Reince Priebus right after the thing went out, and he had no idea. He said, "I'm trying to find out." Reince was the chief of staff at the time. So here you had a completely unhinged allegation made by a current president of a president that just left office, and usually, there's deference given by both former presidents who keep quiet, current presidents who don't take time to attack their predecessors. So that was completely thrown off. And you had a sitting president of the United States making ridiculous allegations with no evidence that his people were totally unaware of.
So it worked up to September 10, 2020, when you asked the president, and I quote, "Why did you lie to the American people? And why should we trust what you have to say now?" You must have known he would go nuclear when you asked that question.
I did. And I have to confess, when I asked that question, although the specific subject was COVID and what he had told Bob Woodward, we had him on tape back in April of 2020, acknowledging that he knew full well the extent of the disease. Actually, there was a Woodward tape from February, even before he had come out and said ridiculous things like it's just like the flu. We knew that he knew. Not only we always knew that he was saying something that was not true, but here we had cold hard evidence that he knew what he was saying was not true, right. And he even explained why he said it. So it was by any definition a lie, an intentional lie. But my confession, Bill, is that when I asked that question, I intentionally left it exactly as you read, not specific to that, because in a way I felt that it was a question that covered all 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you lie to the American people? Not just about this. I mean, he had been lying consistently since he took office. And why should we trust anything you have to say now? So it was specifically brought on by the smoking gun evidence that Bob Woodward produced, but it was a question that I thought got to the core essence of the Trump presidency.
And then, as expected, he went on the attack against you. Did you suffer by being blackballed or cut out of events or cut out of interviews from the White House at the White House for a while?
First of all, it was interesting to see how it truly rattled him. He came back and he called me a disgrace to the ABC television network. He said he went on, and we went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth after I started with that question. And then he took 2 more questions very quickly and ended the press conference. And it was clear that he was rattled. And he's not a guy that you normally see rattled. And That did surprise me. In terms of getting, blackballed, one thing I learned is there's an expression, and I forget who first said this, that when you try to like suck up to somebody in power to get the good stuff, you realize there really is no good stuff. It's like the good stuff's vastly overrated. They're going to give you what they want to give you and what they want to get out. And look, I had already been, his press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, I had already called out for being essentially a political propagandist. And, I wasn't exactly talking much to her anyway. Other people in the Trump White House will talk to you, I found, regardless, because they're usually out to get somebody else in the Trump White House. So I didn't notice any significant change, actually, besides him yelling at me on national television and calling me a disgrace.
So this was COVID related. Would you agree that how Trump handled COVID is basically the central story of his presidency?
Well,
it certainly occupies a great deal of your book, Betrayal.
Yes, it does. My only hesitation on that is his attack on our democracy. What he did, both in the lead up to the election, he certainly laid the groundwork for doing it. But what he did during the transition that led up to January 6th, it's hard to.
Yeah.
It's like what's more defining a mishandling of a pandemic that killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, or a frontal assault on American democracy? I mean, I think they're both pretty big.
Good point. Do you think had he handled COVID better, he would have been reelected?
I was of the feeling that he was almost certainly to lose no matter what, because he won in 2016. It was, as I called it in Front Row at the Trump Show, it was a black swan event. Black swan events don't tend to happen twice in a row. Mm-hmm. It was I mean, you have to give him credit. It was the greatest upset in the history of American politics. But he had spent the following 3 years before COVID systematically alienating the very people that he would need to win re-election, independents, women. So I think that it was unlikely. He's only going to win on these circumstances. But I do believe that if there was a way for him to win, the handling of COVID provided an opportunity. If he had handled it better, and even as late as getting COVID himself, he gets COVID. He is medevaced to Walter Reed. He's even before that, he's put on oxygen. His chief of staff is afraid that he may die, and he recovers. And he does that cinematic return to the White House at sunset on Marine One, and the walk up the stairs and the taking off the mask and all that stuff. But if he had used that and come out and said, "I've now seen it. I've experienced it. I've felt it. It almost took my life. Take this thing seriously." I don't know if it would have been enough for him to win, but I think that it would have changed the race, would have made a difference. But instead, he, there's like nothing. Yeah. There's nothing after that.
Right. As you indicated, he was like he was take off open his shirt and have a Superman shirt right under it. I've conquered this, which gets me as closely as I followed this, the Trump campaign or the Trump presidency. And thought I knew it all. There's a lot of new stuff in your book that I didn't realize. And you just touched on one of the points. He was a lot sicker than we thought, or than the White House let us know, which even led to more lies from the White House and from the White House doctors about his situation.
Yeah, I tried to spell this out because I thought, look, doctors or White House is lying about a president's medical condition. Now, that is something that is not new to Donald Trump. We've seen that, Woodrow Wilson. We saw it with JFK. We saw it, we've seen it over and over again. But they were just flat out lying. They weren't like not disclosing. They were proactively saying things that were just not true, including his own doctor through statements. I mean, I expect the lies to come from the press secretary at that point, but to hear the president's doctor, I guess with the Ronnie Jackson experience, maybe I shouldn't have been all that surprised. Just flat out lying about his condition.
Was he told by Trump to tell that lie?
Trump did, I describe in the book, choreograph just about everything that the doctors said. So I don't have a direct line that Trump said, go out and say X, Y, and Z, but I mean, he was choreographing the whole thing. So he was clearly acting on Trump's wishes, whether or not it was a direct, instruction from Trump or not. I mean, I recount in the book, you remember the striking image of the team of doctors, all in their white coats, in formation, walking out in front. It was really a really amazing image. I remember at the time, wow, that's impressive. And that was Trump from his bed, hospital bed, saying, you guys, the coats, got to keep them on. I want you all out there. The guy knows television. He knows images. Mm-hmm. He does.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.